Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion IT Modernization for Citizen Services, sponsored by Amazon Web Services on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is Mark Schwartz, an enterprise strategist for the Amazon Web Services. Now, Mark, before break, we just started to talk a little bit about that culture change piece. And that's one of those things I think when people hear, they go, oh no, not the culture change discussion. It's never the technology, it's always the culture. But I think in this case, when we talk about citizen services, you need to get people to think differently. You need to have them look at problems differently and be part of the solution. So maybe give me, from your experience at the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services or other experiences, what have you seen? What gets people to change? How does it motivate them?
Well, the big change, in my opinion, really, is that they have to get used to thinking in terms of small increments, right? Iterative change with small changes. And that's very risk mitigating when you think about it, right? Instead of committing to a really big initiative with a big budget that's not going to deliver results for many years, you can deliver actual results really quickly and then incrementally add to those. The reason why this is a hard cultural shift is it implies that because your risk is lower and because you're moving quickly, you shouldn't do a really complex, heavyweight oversight process to make decisions, right? You make provisional decisions and you change them downstream, rather than, as we had to do in Homeland Security, write 87 documents and go through 11 gate reviews and have 22 people in different oversight roles. It's not necessary when you're committing small amounts of money and working incrementally with results all along the way. So that's the big change. And how did we get people to do that? Well, a lot of it, I think, had to do with engaging middle management. I sometimes hear companies sometimes talk about frozen middle management that's not changing. And I almost always think that's a mistake of leadership, not to get middle management to support the change and engage in it. That's the leverage point, you might say.
What did you do? What steps did you take when you were at USCIS to get those GS14s and 13s and 12s on board beyond, hey, I'm the boss, you gotta follow me? And that only works maybe once in a while.
Yeah. First I'd say, I'm the boss, you gotta do what I say. And then they would leave the meeting, go out in the hallway and say, the CIO is completely crazy, we're not gonna do this.
So that was fair.
That doesn't really work.
That was fair. You were doing back in 2012, you were doing some crazy stuff.
I had to learn a few lessons, I would say. But the key, I think, is changing incentives of those people. And I don't mean financial incentives, right? In the government, we can't really do that. It's changing the role definition, changing their understanding of how they contribute to mission, things like that. So for example, if the QA organization thinks of itself in terms of swooping in at the end of a project and saying, oh no, the quality is not good enough, that's not going to support these new ways of changing. If instead they think of their job as being part of the process throughout and making sure everything is produced at a high level of quality, that fits beautifully into the digital way of working. And it's just a matter of changing their understanding of what their role is.
Did you bring in the quality assurance folks, the QA folks, again, very similar to the users at the very beginning, as you're planning the project, as you're beginning that first set of code release, hey, you're here, you're part of it, and that's the change that happens because all of a sudden they're not being brought in at the end, like the security people we say, bolt it on, build it in, but it's the same concept. Bring those folks in who matter at the beginning, and then they feel part of that project, and that changes the culture.
Even more than that, we brought them in before the beginning. We actually had QA involved in training because they wanted to make sure everybody was prepared to operate at a high level of quality. Since you mentioned security, though, that's an extremely important principle for security, is having them involved from the very beginning, involved in engineering, involved in determining what the automated security tests should look like and what policies need to be enforced in the cloud and things like that.
This leads us down the path of this idea of, okay, to change culture, you also need to show progress. You need to get those quick wins. And I think one of the things that you did at USCIS that was always fascinating was not just getting quick wins for your internal folks, but the contractor side. You had the contractors say, hey, if you guys don't work together to make us successful, one of you is gone, or both of you are gone, or you're not getting any more task orders. Talk about that idea of quick wins and why is that's the next piece to change the culture.
Yeah, we realized that we were going to need to be to interact with the contractors a lot more, let's say, than the old model where we might spend 3 years competing a contract and then give a whole batch of stuff to the contractor and say, come back when you're done, right? That wasn't working really well for us, so we wanted a much more interactive process where we could have lots and lots of feedback and make changes as we went. So that was the motivation for it. And we did, in fact, set up contracting structures where contractors had an incentive to keep performing. We could readjust the contract as we went. The flip side of that, though, that a lot of people didn't notice, I think, was we gave the contractors constant feedback so that they could improve their performance, and they loved that aspect of it. You know, each contractor, I think, is convinced that they are the best ones around. And I understand that, you know, they're mission driven and they're passionate about what they do. And so if we could tell them, you know, here's the problem we're seeing with the way you're doing this, they would very often react really quickly to it and make sure they fixed it.
And I think part of reacting very quickly so you don't get into a situation where you're putting bad money after bad money after bad money, and all of a sudden you've spent $50 million and have nothing to show because the contractor said, well, I was following your requirements. So now you're doing $5 million or $500,000, seeing, okay, this isn't right, fix it. Okay, now you're kind of fixing as you go along and ensuring that you're meeting the user's needs. And I think that's the other piece of the culture change we're talking about here is, oh, I get it now. They start to see the impact they're having.
That's right. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to break things down into those small pieces and to work incrementally, showing results the entire way.
We talked a little bit about the culture, the quick wins. There's still the piece of the technology, and a lot of agencies are moving to the cloud. It's I think, a little slower than I expected, but I think what they saw with the pandemic and over the last 20 months or so is the power of the cloud and the power of moving toward a DevSecOps approach. What's the biggest issue you're seeing these days about it? Is it still risk aversion? Is it not enough money? They can't move fast enough? Or not enough workforce? What is it? Yes, I know.
Risk aversion is a really interesting thing to think about because a lot of organizations think they're risk averse, but the truth is they could reduce their risk by working in the cloud and using DevSecOps and these other techniques, right? We're talking about, let's say, working in the cloud where you can change your infrastructure at any moment as opposed to committing to fixed upfront infrastructure costs where you can't change your infrastructure downstream, and that imposes risk. Same thing with these big monolithic projects, very risky. Work in DevSecOps, work in the cloud, you're getting results very quickly. So if you're truly risk averse, you really should be moving to these things. But I think we're dealing with something that's not quite risk aversion, it's more like fear. is more really what it's about. Or status quo bias. You know, people tend to stick with what they've got. What gets in the way, I think, is that discomfort with moving quickly in small increments. Because the first time you do it, you feel a little unsteady. You know, like, shouldn't I have done more due diligence before I made a decision or something like that? Once you realize that you're getting positive results all along the way, then that discomfort starts to go away. But I've always found that to be the biggest impediment.
The status quo bias, I love that terminology because what we saw, and I've heard this, for instance, from the Veterans Affairs Department, where they actually had kind of non-IT folks say to their IT folks, hey, this IT stuff's kind of important, huh? And it's like, we've been telling you I'm sure every agency had that experience. And I think that urgency really opened people's eyes to say, okay, we've got to make this IT thing better. Are you seeing conversations change with the non-IT folks? I mean, you may spend time with some CIOs, but is the time you're spending with the non-CIO folks much more impactful? Do they get it in a bigger way than ever before?
Yeah, we do have that status quo bias. I think that's always the first reaction is like, oh, we're gonna move to the cloud, or we're gonna change to DevOps or something. You know, this big stuff that maybe there's more important stuff for you to be doing. But if I then ask them, are you satisfied now with the speed of response you're getting from the IT organization? Are you satisfied with your ability to make changes quickly? They'll almost always think about it and say, actually, no. You know, They just sort of put that out of their heads and act like they're comfortable with the status quo. And really, when it comes down to it, IT organizations can be responsive and can move really quickly if they have the right tools and the right architectures in place.
And I think we're starting to see that with a lot of the effort agencies are doing around, for instance, Enterprise Infrastructure Solutions contract, EIS, the GSAs. It's really the network base. The push from OMB around some of the architectures like Zero Trust to say, hey, we need to put the identity and access management pieces, all these pieces in place to get you to be able to move faster. Is that the big message you probably would leave folks with here is think about the architecture, think about the tools, but also think about the approach you're taking more holistically than just the technology side. What's the message you think most people need to leave this conversation with?
Yeah, I think the most important thing for me is to focus on mission. I mean, we all know that,
it's so
right?
easy.
I mean, it's so obvious. It's easy when you're thinking about the cloud and DevOps and stuff like that to get all caught up in spreadsheets with the cost of each instance and that sort of thing. No, the question is, how are you going to be able to accomplish your mission better by being able to move more quickly, by having the right tools at your disposal? And then you work backwards from that to build your business case and to determine how you actually execute once you start moving.
And I think that's a key piece that I think sometimes does get lost in this conversation is the mission first. If you put mission first, everything kind of should fall into place. Mark, I've really much enjoyed our conversation. It's great to catch up with you again, but unfortunately we are out of time for today. So let me thank my guest. Mark Schwartz is an enterprise strategist at Amazon Web Services. Mark, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion IT Modernization for Citizen Services, sponsored by Amazon Web Services on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search AWS.